Okay. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome with the greeting of Islam. I'm really honored. I'm always honored to just be a part of anything Lanterna because I love the community. I love the organic um just just pure wholesome feel of it, and I always love doing anything with Sidi Ustad Sheikhi Ustad Hisham and Hisham. Every time I listen to a lecture of his or talk, I just feel rejuvenated in some sense. um, and so it's really an honor for me to talk about Isa, who was essentially the mujaddid, the rejuvenator of his ummah, Bani Israel. And especially at this time of the year where his legacy, as we talked a little bit about yesterday, has been distorted, commercialized, paganized, and it's upon us, the true followers of Jesus, to revive again a tajdid, a revival of that legacy. So what we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit about history. Um, what was it like? Just like when you talk about the life of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, you talk a little bit about the history of the Arabian Peninsula and the contextual situation there. We're going to do that a little bit with Isa, the same thing that we do with the Prophet Muhammad, except we're going to have to talk a little bit about Rome, and the Roman Empire, and what things were like at that time to better contextualize the arrival of Isa into that society. And then we're not going to talk too much about his life because the point of this talk is to talk about crucifixion. You have to have the background to talk about the crucifixion, but I will say a few things about his life because it is important to understand his role as a Messiah. We'll talk a little bit about the crucifixion then, from an Islamic point of view and non-Orthodox. I'm going to put that in quotations because we'll talk a little bit about Orthodoxy too. Christian point of view. And then what I would say is the compassion, not passion of Christ, but the compassion of Christ, which is his return to establish justice on earth and final fulfillment of what it means to be a Messiah. Um, so that's the goal for today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about what happened afterwards. Why did things change? So we'll talk a little bit about Paul, Christology, and the history of the church to better understand why the message of Jesus at the time of Jesus and from the mouth of Jesus is no longer the religion that claims Jesus. Um, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. I've got about 70 or so odd slides to do today, so I'm going to go fast. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the chat. I I would like you all, as you have questions, to just interrupt, ask as I go, because there's too much information. You're probably going to forget your questions at the end, and if I feel like we're running short on time, then we might punt some for later. But that's what I think that's what the plan here is. A lot of my sources I'm not referencing. Some of them I am, but I mean, there's almost 20 or 30 sources here in this presentation. If you're curious about a source, just let me know. I'll tell you what the source is. Um, but um, yeah. So can you all see my screen? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. Oh wait, um let me do something here. Move this chat so I can see my screen better. And I'll move this and move this. Okay, let me do that again. Okay, everyone's still with me, right? All right. Okay, so Jesus, man, messenger. Messiah. So what are we going to basically what I just said. So I won't go over this slide here, but basic objectives for the next couple days. So the first part, just part one, we're going to talk a little bit about messianic fervor, Roman rule, and then the subsequent crucifixion. That's misspelled on purpose. That's how said Hisham spelled it. Obviously, the Islamic belief is that this is a fiction more than a reality. Um, so let's talk a little bit about Jerusalem. As you can see from this really basic map here, okay, it was a highly prized area in the pre-modern world to have because you could control Egypt through Jerusalem, or you could have influence in Egypt, and you can also control the Fertile Crescent through Jerusalem. So it was a very strategic place to have. Um, so many empires in the past, Egypt and the pharaohs conquered Jerusalem several times. Persia conquered Jerusalem. The Assyrians conquered Jerusalem. The Alexander the Great conquered Jerusalem, and eventually the Romans were going to conquer. They all wanted Jerusalem because Jerusalem was very strategic to have in terms of um, an empire or a power in a world without borders, right? As you can just clearly see from the map. The issue is the Israelites also claimed Jerusalem. So this is a very sort of contested verse in the Old Testament, where God is telling Abraham that he is going to give him and his descendants, and then the descendants is clarified later as being Isaac, through the line of Isaac, not Ishmael. It's very important. It'll come up again. All of the land of Canaan. Well, Canaan is basically what is today Sham, Jordan, Palestine, Syria, and extended from that as well. So even though everyone wants this land, theologically speaking, the Israelites believe that it's their right, right? So obviously there's going to be a tension here. And when they enter into the land, this is also another hotly contested verse in the Old Testament. They're supposed to kill everything and not let anything survive. Quite unfortunately, this verse has been utilized recently in the genocide of Palestine um, as as a Zionist sort of justification for killing the innocent lives of Palestinians. But even and so many people would even question the authenticity of this verse because it's not very consistent. It's not consistent at all with justice or the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the point here is not to get into that. The point here is to say that the Israelites themselves felt an entitlement such that something that would not be shared with anyone, yet they're constantly dominated over and over again. So here is the temple that um, Solomon built. You see there in the left side of the screen. That was eventually destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar around the 6th century before the Common Era. And then it was rebuilt again when the Persians allowed the Israelites to come back. So a much larger version was built again, Herod's temple. But the Macedonians took over this. The Romans are going to later take over this, and when they take over, they place their gods in the temple. They place a golden eagle in the temple. They make the leaders of the temple pay homage to the Roman emperors, and we know the Roman emperors themselves saw themselves as sons of God. That's important too. That'll come up later. So literally in this temple, which was supposed to be consecrated for the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only, right? And the Quran refers to this project as Masjid al-Aqsa, the furthest mosque. Okay. It was desecrated with polytheism, very similar to how the Kaaba was desecrated with polytheism. The first temple, the Kaaba was the first temple built by Abraham and Ismail. Also important, also going to come up again. But what then does this do? Just try to think about this contextually. Try to think about this in terms of, okay, what if you were the only monotheistic people on earth at that time and you felt like um, you are like there's a polytheistic cult imposing themselves on you, right? What would you do? Oh, here's also some coinage um, that has a Roman emperor on it. This is something that comes up in the New Testament. They had to exchange the coins for people to come into the temple because even the coins were polytheistic. So you couldn't use polytheistic coins in the temple, and this was also a means through which the Sadducees and the Pharisees would charge interest on people and abuse them monetarily just for them to have access into the temple. This will come up again, but the whole story about Jesus overthrowing the money changers. That's what that has to do with. Okay, so this is what things looked like a few decades before Jesus. Everything purple here is the Roman Empire. A lot of people forget a good portion of North Africa was ruled by the Roman Empire, and what is current day Turkey, Greece, Europe, all the Roman Empire. And so they ruled over Jerusalem and they imposed their Greek, Hellenistic, polytheistic beliefs upon the Jews, upon the temple. They had some autonomy, but a large part of it they felt like was violated. So you had these three different classes of Jews at that time. You had the Pharisees, and they were kind of like if you will, like the fuqaha, right? They were specialized in the law. You had the Sadducees. They were a little bit more politically savvy, a little bit less theologically savvy. So they tended to have more connections with the Roman government. But they were also leaders of the temple. The Essenes we learned about recently because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were a community near Qumran, which was a bit further away from Jerusalem, but still within distance. And they kind of established their own community out of protest um, from the corruption that was occurring in the temple. But these are the three main Jews you had at that time. Josephus, who's an important historian, he writes about almost 100 years after Jesus. He's a Jew, but he's kind of employed by the Roman government. And so he's writing a history. And these are the groups of Jews at that time. But there's a fourth group here. The fourth group are the Zealots. Now, who are the Zealots and why they're called Zealots? Well, again, go back to this idea that there's a frustration building up amongst Beni Israel, amongst the Israelites. Again, they feel like it's their land. They feel like um, uh, they are being violated theologically, politically speaking. Um, and they want to get back to ownership of the temple as it's supposed to be, right? They want to remove all pagan influence. So a group of Jews start to form a few decades before the coming of Jesus, whose goal and mission is to kill anyone and everyone associated with the Roman government, and just frustrate the Roman government. These are going to be called the Sicarii. Okay. And Reza Aslan does a really good job talking about them in his book about Jesus called Zealot. Um, but but yeah, so there's you can start to appreciate some of the tension here. And there were several of these zealots who would arise, gain a following, okay, and then claim to be the Messiah. We're going to talk a lot more about the Messiah this time, but here's the Messiah is the other part of this equation. Because as this frustration is building up amongst the Israelites, the conversation of a savior to come and get them out of this situation is also building up. There are many references in the Old Testament to a coming Messiah. We're going to talk about all of them. Okay. Um, and at this point, it's like sometimes you have something there in the text, you have something there in your book, but it's only a particular historical contextual situation that makes you start to look at it in a new way. They always had those verses there about the Messiah, but now that they're being theologically and politically oppressed, now they're starting to look at it again and say, "Oh, wait a minute. Now is the time. Now is the time when the Messiah is going to come." So you had these group like Simon of Perea was one of these zealots who rose up, got a following, claimed to be the Messiah. Athronges, the shepherd boy, another one. His Hezekiah, another one. Judas the Galilean, another one. All of these people before Jesus, all of them claiming to be the Messiah, all of them a part of this zealot movement. What are they claiming? I'm the Messiah. I'm going to liberate you now from Rome, right? What does Rome do with all of them? You'll see in a second. They all get destroyed. Okay. But keep something in mind. The Messiah is meant to be the king of the Jews. He's one who's appointed, okay? He's appointed for a special purpose. That purpose is to eliminate oppression, defeat God's enemy. He could be a king or a prophet, okay? So Moses was a kind of Messiah. Um, uh, Talut in the Quran for them was a kind of Saul was a kind of Messiah. Um, David was a kind of Messiah. Okay, now they're expecting another one. Okay. They even refer to Cyrus as a Messiah. Cyrus, the king of Persia, who liberated the Jews and allowed them to go back to anyone who liberates the Jews is essentially a Messiah. So it could be a king, it could be a prophet, it could even be I guess, according to the Old Testament, it could even be a non-Jew. But they were fully expecting someone from the line of David, a king or a prophet from the line of David. Now, just think about something for a moment. We'll talk about this again. If you're the Roman government and you are the king of everyone, you're the emperor of everyone, and someone starts to claim that they're the king of the Jews, that's a political threat. That's a political threat. Okay, so that's going to be seen as a type of sedition. I think in some dictatorial countries now, you can't even be the president of the chess club. That would be a threat to the to the president of the country. Okay, so imagine like being a king of the Jews. All right, so what did Rome do with all these people? They just crucified them. Crucifixion was very, very common. And a misconception is that they used to make crosses for all these people. No, they didn't make crosses. Crucifixion was done on anything that stood up on the ground, a tree with a couple branches, could be a cross, it could be just a piece of anything that's sticking out of the ground. The lowest of society were always crucified. Even this is not just Rome. Pre-modern, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. Actually, in the Quran, لَأُقَطِّعَنَّ أَيْدِيَهُمْ وَأَرْجُلَهُم مِّنْ خِلَافٍ. Right? What does Pharaoh say? وَلَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. I'm gonna crucify all of you, right? And cut your hands and feet off from the opposite sides. That's Pharaoh. That's Egypt. So this is something that even existed in Egypt. Very, very common thing, very, very common way to punish so-called political criminals in the pre-modern world because the king or the emperor or the pharaoh or whoever, they wanted to send a message. And so what was the best way to do that? Just let someone just hang there so everyone could see them. And in the most painful state possible, right? So at this time, um, Rome is allowing the Pharisees and the Sadducees to run some of their stuff in the temple, but for the most part, they're appointing the leaders. So they have Herod Antipas, who's the king of the Jews. He's appointed by Rome. Pontius Pilate is supposed to be the governor of Judea. Okay, and like on Passover or Jewish holidays, there's all kinds of heightened security. So imagine them bringing more guards into the temple because now is the time where another uprising could kind of come. Okay, it is in this context that Jesus is born, this highly polemical, political, tense situation in which Beni Israel is expecting a Messiah. Okay. And and Rome is expecting an uprising. And the minute someone makes that claim, they're crucified. And there's a kind of like an an army coming and putting down a rebellion and all these things. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about Maryam because we have a separate presentation for that coming up later. But the Quran talks about the coming of Isa in this situation. Okay. Um, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the angel Jibril to Maryam alayhi salam and says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give you good news of a word from him, right? His name will be اسمه المسيح ابن مريم وجيها في الدنيا والآخرة ومن المقربين. His name will be the Messiah, the son of Mary, and he will be honored in this life, in the next, and he will be the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's going to speak to people in his infancy. He's going to be amongst the righteous. Of course, you know the story of Maryam. Says, how can I have a child when no one has ever touched me? And this is the Quran making theology simple. Allah simply says, be and it is, right? We're going to see how this gets very complicated in the early first couple centuries of Christian, the development of Christian orthodoxy. For us, it's very simple. Kun fayakun, be and it is. That's how Jesus came. In مثل عيسى عند الله كمثل آدم. The example of Jesus with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like the example of Adam. Adam didn't have parents. Allah created him. خلقه من تراب. He created him from dirt. And he just said, be and it is. Okay? That's Islamic theology. Be and it is. Very, very simple. Allah is ala kulli shay'in qadir, fully powerful over everything. Okay? So, what is the role of Jesus? He's going to be given the Injil, okay? A book of revelation. He's going to be given guidance. He's going to be taught the Torah, and he's going to confirm the Torah. We're not going to get into these verses because we're going to have a separate presentation for that. But he's constantly performing miracles. He's speaking in his birth. He's sent only to the children of Israel. This is something that the Quran confirms. This is something that the Bible confirms in Matthew. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is really important. A lot of Christians don't know this very, very basic point. Jesus was not a Christian. Okay. Jesus, so in a theological sense, was a Muslim. Okay. Because he was someone who submitted his will to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all of the prophets are Muslim. Muslim just means someone who submits their will to Allah. But ethnically speaking, he was a Jew. Ethnically speaking, he was a Jew. He was from Bani Israel. He was sent to Bani Israel for Bani Israel. And that's something that the Gospel of Matthew even confirms. He was not a Christian. Okay. It's a very, very basic point. That term doesn't even come up until a couple centuries later. What was he supposed to do? He was supposed to confirm and clarify what was being practiced from the Torah, because the practice of the Torah at this point had become corrupted. وَمُصَدِّقًا بِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيَّ مِنَ التَّوْرَاةِ وَلِأُحِلَّ لَكُمْ بَعْضَ الَّذِي حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. Confirming the teachings of the Torah. This is really, really important because Paul is going to deviate from this completely when he talks about his new covenant theology. So Jesus confirms the teachings of Moses and that you have to continue to follow the law. You have to have Sharia. Okay. You have to have orthopraxy, the right way of living. Okay. And faith plus works is what earns you the mercy of God. Okay. That's going to be completely changed in early church history. Okay. Um, and he says, to ease some of these restrictions that have been placed on you, many of the laws of dietary laws, Sabbath laws of Beni Israel, they were placed on them as punishments. What Jesus is going to do, he's going to reduce some of this, like a takhfif, make things easy. Also, what had happened at this time, spiritually, Beni Israel had become more dead. They became very, very focused on the letter of the law. Okay. Ultra legal, but not thinking about the maqasid of the law, the greater goals and objectives, the aspects that really connect you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and connecting to the law, the way um, it is supposed to actually make you closer to God rather than just turn you into a fanatic. Um, so Isa was doing a kind of ihya. He was doing a kind of revival of the law, right? He wasn't eliminating the law. He was reviving the law. Think about Ghazali and his project, Ihya Ulumuddin. It was a similar frustration. Ghazali felt like many of the scholars had become too rigid and too focused on the trees and missing the forest. And he wanted to revive much of the Sharia by bringing people back and seeing the greater goals and objectives of the law. That was the project of Isa. Here's an example of in Mark, okay, that we can find where some of the Pharisees, remember the Pharisees in the temple, they were the ones who were kind of the legal experts. Okay, they gathered around Jesus and some of his disciples, and they saw that they were eating with their hands unwashed. Why was that a big deal? Well, because in the land of Judea, which was ruled by Rome, There was a lot of impurities in terms of how animals were killed, slaughtered, consumed, and you had to have extensive washing of hands, utensils, and everything before you could eat anything because there was a fear of potential mixing of impure food with pure food. So the Pharisees asked Jesus, why don't your disciples eat according to the tradition of the elders, which is to extensively wash their hands? Remember, very, very focused on the, instead of eating with defiled hands. And so Jesus says, understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of the person that defiles them. So he's not necessarily saying you don't follow the law, but rather what he's saying is you missed a bigger point. You're so concerned about the outward filth. You're missing the inner part, okay? Of look, your words, your character, the things that come out of you, that's what might defile you. Now, whether this is a true statement from Jesus or not, we know that we don't necessarily have an opinion on, but it would be consistent with what the Quran is saying. وَلِيُحَلِّلُكُمْ بَعْضَ الَّذِي حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. So these miracles, if you think about what is the bigger picture here, well, they all have significance in and of themselves. I don't mean to bypass each and every one miracle significance. But look, there's a kind of ihya in his miracles. He brings the dead back to life. He brings eyesight back to life. He brings birds to life out of clay, right? How is this consistent with his message? Well, his message was to bring the law back to life. What he was doing is he was bringing the Sharia of Moses back to life because the Sharia is supposed to give you life. It's actually a path to water. That's what the word Sharia means. It's a path to water. And water is what gives you life. So if the law is not giving you life, spiritual life, something's wrong with how you're practicing the law. The Quran says, استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. Respond to Allah and His Messenger when they call you to that which gives you life. That is the Sharia, right? So, um, and this last thing just about Jesus's life, this is all from the New Testament, by the way. Um, Jesus never, ever claims to be God. Never claims to be God. In fact, you can find multiple references in the New Testament to where Jesus is making salah. Look at Mark 135, okay? He goes off when it's dark in the morning. What time is that? That's Fajr. He's going off during Fajr time and he goes and prays, okay? Matthew 26:39. He falls on his face. What is that? Sujud, praying, okay? In Luke 5:16, he goes off to lonely places and prays. If Jesus claimed to be God, who was he praying to? Who was he praying to? And again, the point of the Messiah, we're going to go over this over and over again, so I won't stay too much on this slide, but the point was to liberate Beni Israel and establish God's kingdom on earth. Now, Jesus is called the Messiah. He calls himself the Messiah. The Quran says that he's wajihan fi dunya wal akhirah. So he's the king of the Jews and he's noble and prominent amongst them. Okay. What is that going to do? Think about this from the perspective of the leaders of the temple and from the perspective of the political leaders of Rome. From the perspective of the leaders of the temple, if he's wajih, prominent, noble, he has all these miracles that he can do, and they can't do them. And he's teaching the law in a way that undermines their authority. Basically, he's teaching the law in a way that shows he knows the Torah better than the Pharisees and Sadducees do. And he knows what the real teachings of it are. Well, that undermines their authority, right? So Jesus's claim to know the Torah better than the Sadducees and Pharisees do, it's going to make him something of a threat to the leaders of the temple. But he also claims to be the Messiah, which means what? King of the Jews. And who's that going to be a threat to? The Roman government. So he's making enemies from both sides, and they will plot to kill him, just like they had plotted Beni Israel to kill many of a prophet before. Jesus is their last chance at the covenant. The Messiah is for the people of the covenant. If they blow this chance, not only are they going to lose their covenant, they're going to lose the Messiah. And the Messiah is going to go and come back to the people of the new covenant. That's what's going to happen. وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. So they plotted and God plotted. And God is the best of plotters. And here is where the Quran significantly deviates from the New Testament. Let me check the time, see how we're doing. Okay, 30 minutes. We're doing okay. Now, here's where we're going to go into a deep dive on the hermeneutics of crucifixion. There are two really important verses that we need to talk about. One is in Ali Imran, verse 55, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذْ قَالَ اللَّهُ يَا عِيسَى. Now here, what is the context? The context is the tension is now claimed to be the Messiah. Word has spread amongst the Jews that he's claiming to be the Messiah. What's Rome thinking? Here we go again. Here we go again. Another shepherd of Athronges, another, Hezekiah. Here we go again. Round up the troops. Okay? That's what Rome's thinking. Send them into the temple. Let's crush this one. What are the Jews thinking? Here we go again. Another Messiah, right? Who's gonna cause all kinds of tension, but they don't really buy into this Messiah because he's messing up the order of the temple. Remember, in the Bible, he's criticizing the monetary sort of banking system of the temple. He's undermining the authority of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they want to get rid of him too. So the Romans and the Pharisees and Sadducees, they all start working together to get rid of him. So what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Now we're going to go into the details here in a second, but just so we understand the basic verses, it called Allah. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, remember when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya Isa, O Isa, inni mutawaffik, pause. Mutawaffi, indeed, verily, I am going to mutawaffik. Now, tawaffa in Arabic, this word I highlighted in blue, and you can see the blue translation, I will take your soul. This is really important because when we start to look at the interpretation of this verse, you got to understand the Arabic so you can understand the possibilities of interpretation. One of the meanings of tawaffa is to take your soul in the sense of sleep. So you're not dead, but your soul is taken, for example, in sleep. Allah says, Allahu yatawaffa al-insan حين موتها والتي لم تمت في منامها. Allah takes souls at the time
الأنفس
of death.
الله يتوفى الأنفس.
Allah يتوفى الأنفس yes, حين موتها. Allah takes the souls at the time of death, but he also takes the souls at the time of sleep when they're not dead. So the word tawaffa is used in that verse, and it could mean both. That's important. وَرَافِعُكَ إِلَيْ, and I'm going to raise you to myself. Now, that's also going to come up and be important. The rest of the verse we can just kind of read. And to purify you from those who disbelieve and make those who follow you, i.e., in submission, right, superior to those who disbelieve. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying the true legacy of Jesus is with those who follow him, obviously not with those who worship him. Okay, so this verse in Ali Imran is key. There's another verse, and again, the color coding corresponds to the translation. وَقَوْلِهِمْ. Now, what is this about? This is in Surah Nisa, verse 157. And Allah now is criticizing the Jews for breaking their covenant. And here is a part of the criticism. وَقَوْلِهِمْ. They said, meaning the Jews said, إِنَّا قَتَلْنَا الْمَسِيحِ. We killed the Messiah. Now they're saying this in a boasting way. Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus the son of Mary, Rasul Allah, and they're sarcastically saying, "Oh, the messenger of God." They're sarcastically saying that, and they're bragging about killing him, right? In other words, over time, this came to be the sort of dominant narrative, and it's a narrative that the Jews bragged about. They took pride in it, right? Allah corrects this narrative and he says, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. They didn't kill him and they didn't crucify him. Okay? وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. This شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ is really important. It was made to seem so, or you could say it was diluted by resemblance. Okay. Now it's a very ambiguous Arabic in the sense, not ambiguous in the sense that it's hard to understand, in the sense that it can mean multiple things. Okay. وَإِنَّ الَّذِينَ اخْتَلَفُوا فِيهِ لَفِي شَكٍّ مِّنْهُ. But those who disputed about this, they are in doubt about it. They have no certain knowledge. They only follow whims. Okay. And they did not kill him of certainty. Or you could say it's absolutely certain that they did not kill him. That certainty is also important and it's going to come up again. Now, let's get into the tafsir. What we're going to find in the tafsir is that there are multiple different opinions about how this happened. Okay. And there's no consistency in the tafsir, no dominant particular opinion. Okay. There is no authentic hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam telling people, here's exactly what happened. And that being the hadith that everyone relies on. So a lot of these mufassirun, classical mufassirun, some of them relied on textual deduction. Some of them relied on uh, reports that they heard from Ahlul Kitab, from Christian. Some of them relied on likely apocrypha writings, okay, that we may not even have available to us today. Who knows how many of these were burned by the Mongols, or other, situations in Islamic history when books were burned or lost. But the Apocrypha basically were gospels or writings or narratives about Jesus that got cut from Team Paul. They got cut from the canon. The early church decided that it doesn't fit with their orthodoxy, but they often have extremely different narratives about Jesus. So I'll just translate this as I go, just the highlights here. This is from Ibn Kathir, in At-Tabari earlier has this as well. So Ibn Kathir probably got this from At-Tabari. But here's a narration from Wahab ibn Munabbah, that أُتي عيسى ومعه 17 من الحواريين في بيت وأحاطوا بهم. Jesus had about 17 or so companions, okay? And the Romans or the temple guards or whoever, they were coming after them, okay? فلما دخلوا عليهم صورهم الله كلهم على صورة عيسى. Allah performed a miracle at that point and made all of them, all 17, look like Isa. Okay? Now, this is going to be called transfiguration, and it comes up in different ways in the explanation of this verse. Okay? Isa at this point, now this is a Tabari, and Ibn Kathir uses this as well. Okay, so so the Romans, they see, that suddenly there's 17 different Isas. And they say, فَقَالُوا لَهُمْ سَحَرْتُمُونَ, you have bewitched us, all of you have bewitched us. لَتَبْرُزَنَّ لَنَا عِيسَى أَوْ لَنَقْتُلَنَّكُمْ جَمِيعًا فَقَالَ عِيسى لِأَصْحَابِهِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي نَفْسَهُ مِنْكُمْ الْيَوْمَ بِالْجَنَّةِ. Um, they say that you have bewitched all of us. Either you're gonna give us Isa, or we're gonna kill all of you, right? And so Isa asked his companions, which one of you wants to buy paradise today for selling his soul? Which one of you wants to buy paradise? Okay. فقال رجل منهم أنا. One of them said me. فخرج إليهم فقال أنا عيسى. And he came out and said, I'm Jesus, but he wasn't Jesus. And Allah changed his complexion to look like Jesus. And so they took him and they killed him and they crucified him. فَمِن ثَمَّ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. Same verse in the Quran. And from then it was made to seem so that they crucified Jesus. This theory, this is going to be called volitional transfiguration. Academics will call this volitional transfiguration, meaning someone came up and offered himself to take the form of Jesus so that they would kill him instead of Jesus, and then Jesus was saved from being crucified. Okay. This is theory number one. Here is another form of transfiguration that's punitive, but it's not volitional. Okay. So this is from Tafsir al-Kabir of Fakhruddin al-Razi, that when this tension was at its height, right? اليهود لما علموا أنه حاضر في البيت فلاني. The Jews are being sort of brought into the story here. When they knew that Jesus was going to be in the house of such and such person, Amara Yahudan, this one person named Yahud, who was the leader of the Jews at that time, another person from his companions, and it said about him that his name is Taytanus, or it could be Taytanus with a noon, right? And يدخل على Isa, to go to Isa alayhi salam, ويخرجه ليقتله, to bring him out so that they could kill him, the Jews could kill him, right? But when this person, whose name here in this report is Taytanus or Taytanus with a noon, it could be either one. I've seen both. فلما دخل عليه أخرج الله عيسى عليه السلام من سقف البيت. so at that point, when this person went into the house of whoever it was where Isa was staying to grab him and bring him out to be crucified, when he walked into the house, Allah took Isa at that moment and raised him up. And that person who went into the house, Allah, as a punishment for him trying to get Isa, turned him into Isa, meaning made him look like Isa. And then they thought that this was Isa and they crucified him and they killed him. This would be called punitive transfiguration. Okay. So it's not that someone offered to look like Jesus, someone was punished to look like Jesus. Okay. This opinion is also mentioned in the books of tafsir. Now I'm mentioning Fakhruddin al-Razi. You will find each one of these opinions in other books of tafsirs as well. Okay, so now this is taken from Imam al-Qurtubi and al-Biqa'i, who are later Mufassirun. This is something more of a resemblance theory. Okay, there's a bit of a nuance here. Just stay with me. Um, uh, ألقى الله سبحانه وتعالى شبهه على غيره كما تقدم في آل عمران وقيل لم يكونوا يعرفون شخصه وقتلوا الذي قتلوه وهم شاكون فيه. There was another person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala um, made to kind of look like Jesus, but it wasn't transfiguration. It was the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made people see another person as Jesus, and they didn't really know Jesus that well, the Romans. So to them, it's just kind of like the typical racist thing, you all look alike, you know? And so they thought they got the right person, and Jesus wasn't that well known because he was, was a very spiritual figure and he was known amongst his companions, but he wasn't that well known amongst society. Okay. So, according to this opinion, they killed the wrong person just because they made like mistaken identity. I should have put mistaken identity. Okay. That's another theory. There's another theory because Fakhruddin al-Razi has another opinion. If anyone who's read Fakhruddin al-Razi, you know that he comes with several mas'ala with every ayah. Okay. So he'll say it could have been this, it could have been that, could have been this, could have been that. Ultimately, Fakhruddin Razi says, I don't like any of these explanations, by the way, but he mentions them anyway. Okay. There's another theory. It's kind of like a Jewish conspiracy theory where they saw Jesus being elevated and they didn't like him. So they saw the rafa. They saw Allah elevate Jesus. They did not like him and they didn't want people to start saying, oh, he was definitely the Messiah. Something is going to happen. He was elevated to the heavens. So what did they do? Right? Um, they were afraid of wuku' al-fitna, all kinds of fitna happening um, amongst the common people. So they just took a random person, أخذوا إنسانا, and they killed him and crucified him. And they told people that this was that Messiah that you were talking about. See, he couldn't have been the Messiah. And it was a kind of cover up attempt, right? So that people wouldn't start to jump onto this bandwagon of the message of Jesus. We've seen multiple different, I'm gonna,
Shafia, can I ask
yes,
you a quick question? Are
yes,
you going to entertain the possibility of Judas being that person with resemblance theory? Judas being that person who actually got what was coming to him because he had betrayed
yes.
Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And in that light, it's pretty interesting that you have two different versions in the Gospels of how Judas actually died, where there's not agreement of how he died. So, in Matthew 27, he hangs himself, and in Acts, which was written by Mark, he casts himself from a cliff, and his bowels gush forth when he reaches the ground. So there's actually not agreement from the gospel traditions as to what happened to Judas exactly. And I find it interesting that with resemblance theory or punitive theory, basically punitive, that this could have been the man who was crucified in the place of Jesus, and Allah knows best. But I just wanted to. I was
Yeah, it's
wondering if
coming
you were going
up.
to cover that. Oh,
It's
I'm
coming
so
up.
sorry. I'm so sorry.
Some of the later
I
more
spoke out of turn.
contemporary.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. Some of the more contemporary mufassirun are going to mention that a little bit more.
Okay.
But it's also mentioned directly in the Gospel of Barnabas.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna get to that. So I was gonna mention
Okay.
it when I get to Barnabas, but
Okay. Okay.
yes,
Very good. Because
the
I saw
fact
you were
that
going to grammatical considerations, so I thought you were done with the theories. So I
no,
apologize
it's
for
gonna
that.
come back. It's gonna
Okay.
come back,
Very good.
but
Thank you.
the fact that there's no clear what you were mentioning about Judas, multiple different accounts of how he was killed. It lends credence to this idea that they didn't really understand how he died. Because if they really understood how he died, they would have had a set story, but they don't have a set story. So it's almost like they're trying to. So that would lend credence to the idea that it was Judas, because there's confusion about what happened to Judas, you know? But yeah, Judas is in the Gospels. He's the one who he kind of betrays Jesus, and as Ustad was saying. So. Here's an important grammatical consideration by Az-Zamakhshari. Az-Zamakhshari was a very famous mufassir. He was a Mu'tazilite, but he was a linguistic expert. So a lot of people like to read his tafsir not because of the theology of Az-Zamakhshari, but because of his linguistic nuance and insight. And one of the things he says in his tafsir is that I'm just gonna summarize it for you here, okay? The shubbiha lahum, it was made to seem so it this theme so is not in the person necessarily that was crucified. It's in the imagination of the people who came to believe it later. Okay, that's what Az-Zamakhshari says. Okay, this ambiguity happens in the minds of people in society, and he says that the word shubbiha is often used in the context of imagination. So he's looking at it from a linguistic point of view, and he says that word shubbiha, it's usually shubbiha lahum. When you use it like that, it's talking about what's happening in the mind of someone, not necessarily what's happening outside the mind of someone. Now, based on that, this is really important. Muhammad Asad has a really, really important commentary. Who was Muhammad Asad? Muhammad Asad was a polymath. This guy spoke like 8 different languages, and he was a Jew. And he converted to Islam. He has a very famous book about the road to Mecca, which is kind of his experience in making Hajj. Um, and so early 20th century, he converts to Islam. He masters Arabic. He writes an entire commentary on the Quran. You all might have seen that's that big, thick. Care used to give out his tafsir for free. It's a massive tafsir book, and it's huge. It weighs like 25 pounds. And it's his commentary in the Quran. What does he say in his commentary? He says, using Zamakhshari. So he uses this linguistic expert, and he says, all of these stories about transfiguration, I don't buy any of that. The shubbiha lahum that linguistically says something is happening in the imagination of people. What this suggests is that over time, over decades, a narration started to form that people started to believe. And in their minds, they started to find this belief that Jesus was crucified over time. Okay. And all of these stories about transfiguration, this, that, and the other, I don't buy that. They're not based on an authentic hadith. They're not based on anything authentic in the Quran. So he says that possibly under Mithraistic beliefs, which was, polytheistic beliefs that existed in Rome about resurrection, possibly influenced by Zoroastrianism, these ideas of resurrection and death, they evolved over time. He doesn't mention Paul too much, but it's also a part of this. And so he says, over time, that's what the Shukbiha means. Over time, they came to believe. Now, who was actually crucified? What actually happened there? He doesn't talk about that too much, but he says this is something that happened over time. Okay. Then you have this last theory called the swoon theory. Now, what is the swoon theory? Go back to that word tawaffa, mutawaffiq. And I told you it could mean going to sleep or it could mean dying. Okay. The swoon theory, and this was made popular by Ahmed Didat. some of you may remember Ahmed Didat. He was this very popular debater who, like in the 80s and 90s, he used to do a lot of debates with Christians. And this would come up and he would talk about this. The swoon theory. So, a swoon is when you fall into a coma. It's like you fall into a deep sleep. Okay. It's like a coma-like state, but then you come out of it later. The swoon theory says that Romans and the Jews, they put Jesus on the cross and they nailed him and they almost killed him. He lost a lot of blood. He fell into a coma. Everyone left. And then his companions stayed with him. And what did they notice? After everyone left, he came out of his coma, just like someone who is has orthostatic hypotension, or they lose a lot of blood. They'll go into a coma for a little bit, and then they might, their body will adjust and they'll come out of it. So when he came out of it, everyone had already left. His companions took him off the cross and they took him. And then people saw him eating food, which is mentioned in the New Testament, and they said he must have been resurrected. He must have came back from the dead, right? So a rumor started to form, and that is the shubbiha. That is how they became confused about it. Okay, so that word mutawaffa gives that possibility of that happening. All right. So quick summary of the hermeneutics in the Quran about crucifixion. Okay, we have this possibility of substitution theory, which could be punitive, it could be volitional, or it could be mistaken identity, all that based on shubbiha lahum, right? You find these options mentioned in the books of tafsir. You have this idea of delusion theory. So this is what Muhammad Asad was talking about. Over time, an oral legend developed, right? Mostly kind of like influenced by Pauline Christians, but even Jews, for their own reason, wanted to brag about killing Jesus, and so that's another way of looking at Shubi Halon. And then you have the swoon theory, which is kind of like a almost like a medical theory, right? Yeah, he they put him on the cross, but they didn't fully kill him, right? So the Quranic verse still stands. They didn't kill him and they didn't crucify him, because to have crucified him, he had to have died, right? And so just putting him on the cross doesn't count. So that's also consistent with what the Quran is saying. Now, that is a roundabout summary of the Muslim opinions, and Judas will come up here in a second, that you find here. Okay. Um, but there's also early first century Christians who did not believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the crucifixion, okay, and resurrection. All right. One of these groups was the Ebionites. Who are the Ebionites? We're going to talk more about them tomorrow when we talk about the evolution of the church. But the Ebionites are probably the closest followers to Jesus after his departure. They were of the camp of James. They believed that James, the brother of Jesus, was the true leader of the church. And they were what historians, academics will call Jewish Christians. They accepted Jesus, but only as a man. And they believed he was a prophet. They believed he was sent to the Jews, but they believed that Paul, in his covenant theology, was completely wrong. In fact, they believed that Paul was an imposter, what people might call today like a Roman CIA agent, sent to distort things on purpose. But they believe Paul wasn't even actually a Pharisee. He wasn't even actually a Jew. He was a Roman pagan who was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He just faked it the whole time. And this group was a really, really prominent group. Okay. So they believed you had to follow the law. They were Jewish Christians. They followed Jesus to the T. And they believed in something called the divine rapture. Okay. They believed that Jesus was put on the cross, but before they could kill him, Allah raised his soul up and took his soul away. And so they thought that they killed him because he just stayed on the cross after that. In reality, Allah saved him from crucifixion, because as they put him up on the cross, try to imagine this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took his life right away before they could actually crucify him. So that's called divine rapture. Believe it or not, that would still be consistent with the Quranic verse. That idea of divine rapture, it would still be consistent because it would mean that they did not kill him. They thought they killed him. But what happened? Something divine happened in an intervention where Allah raised his soul. That's rafi'uka ilay, right? And so that would still be consistent. You could still look at the divine rapture theory of the Ebionites and say that still works with the Quranic verses. They believe that Jesus was, so it's something called adoptionist Christology. He became the metaphorical son of God at that point. Okay, meaning he's not divine, he's not the literal son of God, but in the Old Testament the word son of God is used several times in a metaphorical sense. Okay, and they being Jews and following Jewish law, they believed in that version. Then we have, so we know that about the Ebionites, not because we have Ebionite scriptures. We don't have Ebionite scriptures. We know that because early church fathers were so scared of the Ebionites, they wrote all this scathing literature against them. And that's how we know what they believe. That's the Ebionites. Okay. Then we have these apocrypha. What are apocrypha? We kind of mentioned them earlier. There are different accounts of Jesus, many of which we found in the 19, I say we, I didn't find anything. Okay. Scholars found in the 1940s in a place called Nag Hammadi, randomly found by a Bedouin farmer who was looking for fertilizer. He found these scriptures in these jars and he thought it was like uh he thought it might be something valuable, and some of it he ended up just like giving to his mom, and then they used it for a fire that night. Only later was it actually like realized to be something valuable. But it found all these scriptures of early Christian groups whose writings didn't make it into the New Testament. Okay, one of these groups are called the Gnostics. Who are the Gnostics? The Gnostics, actually, a lot of the writings found at Nag Hammadi are Gnostic writing. The Gnostics, they have a lot of weird beliefs about ontology and theology. This world was kind of a mistake, and there are these demigods who are good and these demigods who are bad. And Jesus was, at the time of baptism, his body was taken up by God, and so they believed in something called docetism, which is where um, he only gave the image of a physical body, but the whole time he was divine. That's what the Gnostics believe. So it's confusing. You don't have to understand this. Just the only thing that's relevant here is what they thought about the crucifixion. But what they said is that because Jesus was fully divine and his body was just to make people think that he was human, what they said is that there's no way he could have been crucified because God cannot be crucified. So what happens is you find these different Gnostic gospels that have different stories about what happened at the crucifixion. One of them is the Gospel of Basilides. So Basilides was a second century Gnostic, and he actually claimed to learn from this person who learned from Peter, who learned from Jesus. So he claims this kind of apostolic succession from Jesus. And he says that Simon of Cyrene, who was supposed to carry the cross on the mount for Jesus to be crucified, Simon of Cyrene was actually transfigured. So this is transfiguration in early Christian writings. And Simon of Cyrene was made to look like Jesus, right? And so Jesus was standing above the cross in heaven while Simon of Cyrene was being crucified because everyone thought Simon of Cyrene was. And so the Gnostics, they had this belief that there's no way that Jesus could have been crucified because he was God incarnate, right? Obviously, we don't believe in Gnosticism, but they don't. It's what's interesting is they don't believe in resurrection. They don't believe in anything about resurrection because they say the real resurrection is the internal resurrection. It's the teachings of Jesus that liberate you, and everyone has a divine spark in them, and it's when you follow the teachings of Jesus that your divine spark gets freed, right? And that's your resurrection. So that's what the Gnostics would say. So here's another Gnostic that was discovered at Nag Hammadi. This is the a Coptic apocalypse of Peter. So it's just like the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so these are accounts of Jesus that just did not make it into the New Testament. They were rejected. Okay, and in this account, there's a part where, at the point of like the Passion story, Jesus is talking to his companion Peter, and they're crucifying Jesus, or they think they are. But then Jesus turns to Peter and and tells him that there's someone above the cross. Look up. And he looks up and he sees someone above the cross, glad and laughing. He says, "That's the living Jesus." But he, into whose hands and feet they're driving the nails, is his physical part, which is the substitute. So here's another Gnostic gospel saying somehow Jesus separated from himself, and they thought they were crucifying him, but what they were crucifying is some substitute on the cross. So you find this word substitute, which again you saw used quite a bit in the Muslim tafsirs. You see this word used quite a bit in early um, Gnostic writings and Apocrypha. Okay, and that which they are putting to shame is his likeness, which sounds a lot like shubbiha lahum, tashbih. Okay, but look at him and look at me. So Jesus is like telling Peter, as they're crucifying someone who they think is Jesus, look at Jesus. I'm here above the cross, and they're crucifying someone instead. You also have this Gnostic gospel called the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas is a really interesting gospel. It's 114 sayings of Jesus. That's it. 114 sayings. Now, is that a coincidence? Because there's 114 surahs in the Quran, Allahu Alam. But what's interesting about this gospel, there's no theology of like crucifixion at all. There's nothing, an entire gospel about Jesus, not a single passion story, not a single mention of crucifixion, not a single mention of resurrection. It's almost as if they were saying it doesn't even matter. It's not relevant to the life of Jesus. What's relevant is his teachings. Um, and then you have another really important example here, Ignatius of Antioch. Who was Ignatius of Antioch? He was kind of what we might call like a tabi'i. Okay, so he was of a generation that came after a generation that knew Jesus, and he was one of the early church writers and patriarchs. So, but he was fully Pauline. Okay, and fell into this kind of like Pauline version. So he wrote all these letters, trying to spread Paul's message and dilute the James's sort of like authority of the movement of Jesus. In one of these letters, which he writes to the Magnesians, you can just buy this book on Amazon, which is a collection of his letters. He says something that indirectly shows a lot of people did not believe in crucifixion at that time. He says, "We have seen how former adherents of an ancient custom have attained new hope." What does that mean? Some of the Jews, old custom, that's a reference to the Jews, have attained new hope. What's the new hope? The new covenant. They've followed Paul's teaching. That's what that means. So he's happy about this. He's happy about these new converts. So that they have given up the Sabbath. They no longer follow their law. They now follow Paul's teaching, which is you no longer need the law. Jesus is the new, his body is the new covenant, his body is the new temple, et cetera, et cetera. And now they live by Sunday instead of Saturday. Okay. The day when life first dawned for us, thanks to him and his death, meaning Jesus. Ignatius is saying this. Then look at what he says. That death, though some deny it, that one little statement, he's writing this letter acknowledging that there are other Christians, remember, this is first, second century, that deny crucifixion. Okay. Yet he is a adherent follower of this theory. He says that's the very mystery which makes us believers, even though some deny it. So what's interesting about this is he's acknowledging there are deniers of it. And then we have this gospel of Barnabas. Muslims love to mention this gospel. Okay. But there is some red flags to this book. Okay. Um, because basically it's just an Islamic account of Jesus, fully Islamic account of Jesus. but the text itself is very, very recent. It's about 16th century, maybe 17th century. The original books we have are in Spanish. Um, but what does this gospel say? So Barnabas was one of the actual companions of Jesus. It's written in the name of Barnabas. Most of these writings are pseudepigrapha, which means that the people who write them, we don't know who they actually are, but they put the names of other people on their book. We don't know who Mark is. We don't know who Luke is. We don't know who Matthew is. Okay, it's all pseudepigrapha. Um, and in this gospel, which is supposedly the teachings of Barnabas, the companion of Jesus, Jesus was not crucified. Judas Iscariot was killed in his place because he tried to rat out Jesus and he betrayed him. Jesus is the prophet of God, not the son of God. Paul is a deceiver in this gospel. Paul's teachings will deceive you, right? And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is mentioned directly as the future Messiah. Because of this, and because the book is so late, a lot of even Muslim scholars have kind of questioned um, the authenticity of this. I think it's good to talk about. It's good to have. I don't deny it. I would have a little bit of reservation um, because it's almost too good to be true. But I think that if we find another version of it much earlier, we can put a lot more stock in this gospel, even though a lot of what it's saying we already believe anyway. Okay. So some of these alternate versions of crucifixion from the Apocrypha. So you have divine rapture. We talked about that, Ebionites. You also have substitution theory in the Apocrypha. Okay. You have other books that just kind of say crucifixion, it's not even relevant. It's not even relevant, like the Gospel of Thomas. It's completely irrelevant. And then you have other unknown denial, like for example, Ignatius. He's mentioning that we know other people deny crucifixion, but he doesn't say who they are. But just from that, we know that there were several people, several groups that denied it. Okay, let me pause here. Okay, I know this is supposed to go to 11:15, and it's 11:10 right now. Uh, the next part of this is the return of Jesus. I want to ask you guys, do you prefer that we do that tomorrow and then talk a little bit about early church history? Or do you want to take 15 minutes and just finish this now? But that will eat into the tea break. So
Let's eat into the tea break, Dr. Kia.
let's eat into the tea break. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So that is the story of crucifixion, Tion. Okay. The fiction of the crucifixion, which is the Islamic claim, right? Why would there be a claim? We have to start with this question. Okay. Why would there be a claim that Jesus, as the Messiah, was not crucified? I want you to have that question in your head as we go through this presentation. The short answer, okay, the Messiah is supposed to liberate the people of the covenant, okay? The Messiah being taken from the children of Israel, remember, Allah lifted him and took him away. That is an indication that they are not the people of the covenant. The Messiah is supposed to liberate the people of the covenant. Okay. This is what is indirectly sort of understood from the Old Testament. Okay. That would suggest that if he is coming back, he's not coming back for the Jews. He's not coming back to liberate the Jews. He's coming back to liberate the people of the covenant who the covenant went to um, after the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is the children now of Ishmael. And when I say the children of Ishmael, I mean Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Muhammad is a messenger for all of mankind, regardless of race, ethnicity, or anything like that. So let's talk a little bit about the Jewish concept of the Messiah, um, because this is the Quran continues off of this, right? The Messiah was someone supposed to be anointed, someone whose task was to liberate the children of Israel. Often the Messiah would be anointed with oil, could be a priest, could be a prophet, could be a saintly person. We even saw there's a mention of Cyrus being the Messiah. If someone cannot do these things, if someone cannot remove injustice, liberate the children of Israel, establish God's kingdom on earth, they cannot be the Messiah. That is the Old Testament Jewish belief. Here are some verses from the Old Testament. I'm not going to read each one of these word for word. I'm just going to summarize, but you have the references here. So here are some references to what the Messiah is supposed to do. He's supposed to be a servant of God. He's supposed to establish the kingdom of God. He's supposed to vanquish the enemies of the children of Israel. He will have wonderful abilities. Okay, this is important. When we talk about Dajjal as the false Messiah, this is important. He's going to engage in moral judgment. So he's going to be a lawgiver, okay, a light to all the nations, and his success will it will be a spiritual success. He will be afflicted with some pain and suffering in his society, and he will be from the house of David. This is the Jewish conception of the Messiah. Why did the Jews say Jesus cannot be the Messiah? Because he didn't do these things for them. For them. It's always about them. Okay, it's always about them. So he didn't do it for them. Thus, he cannot be the Messiah. That's the Jewish understanding. Okay. What is a Christian concept of the Messiah? Well, tomorrow we're going to talk about more about Paul. But the Christian approach is to take all of these references in the Old Testament and essentially turn them into metaphor. Okay. So this idea that he will establish the kingdom of God and build a house for my name, Paul is going to say, well, Jesus didn't need to build an actual temple because his body is the new temple. Metaphor. He turned that verse into a metaphor. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. Okay. He's supposed to vanquish the enemies of the children of Israel. That's okay, Paul said. He didn't do that, but the land of Judea doesn't matter. It's the souls of the inhabitants. And he vanquished the souls of the inhabitants from sin. So he did his job as the Messiah. The suffering, well, that was the crucifixion, Paul will say. So Paul's going to take all of these references in the Old Testament. He's going to make them metaphorical. Let's just look at a chart real quick, okay? When it comes to the Old Testament's criteria for Messiah, and does Jesus fulfill those criteria? Okay, if you look at Judaism, the X's mean no, the Y's mean yes. Okay. Well, he wasn't a true servant of God for Jews. He didn't establish God's rule. He didn't destroy God's enemies. He wasn't successful. For the Jews, there are too many X's for him to be a Messiah. For the Christians, um, servant of God, not clear because many of them later are going to say he was God. So there's a lot of ambiguity there, but they're not too worried about that one. Establishing God's kingdom, yeah, that's metaphor. He did it metaphorically, even though he didn't do it actually. Destroying God's enemies, well, sin and the devil is God's enemies. He did that metaphorically. Wonderful abilities, yeah, check that. A light into the nations, yeah, all the Gentiles. Paul's going to totally change that. And then everything else, they check yes. So it doesn't quite work for Christians for him to be the Messiah unless you just change everything and you make it metaphorical. Okay? What about Islam? What about the Islamic narrative of what Jesus is supposed to do? Would that work with the Old Testament criteria of him being the Messiah? Let's talk a little bit about Islamic eschatology. What is eschatology? End times. What's going to happen at the end of time? What Islam says is that there's minor and major signs of the end of time. Minor signs are usually non-tangible. They deal with loss of morality in society, but there are major signs. The major signs, many of you have heard, we're not going to go through all of them. One of them, okay, is the emergence of the Antichrist. And another one is the coming back of Jesus. Right? In the Quran, in Surah Zukhruf, verse number 61, وَإِنَّهُ لَعِلْمٌ لِلسَّاعَةِ. He is a knowledge of the hour, meaning um, um, uh, if you know Jesus' teachings, you will know about the hour. You could also read that as إِنَّهُ لَعَلَمٌ لِلسَّاعَةِ. That's another reading, meaning he's an indication of the coming of the hour. Meaning, an alam is a sign. If you see Jesus coming back, let that be a sign that the hour is coming. Okay, and because of this, many theologians have said that believing in the return of Jesus, it is from the mandates of Iman, meaning if you don't believe in the return of Jesus, you cannot be a Muslim. So in the Aqidah Tahawiyah, for example, we find that Imam al-Tahawi in his creed, he says, وَنُؤْمِنُ بِأَشْرَاطِ السَّاعَةِ. We believe in the signs of the hour, min khuruji Dajjal, from the coming out of the Dajjal, the false Messiah, وَنُزُولِ عِيسَى بْنِ مَرْيَمَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ, and the true Messiah coming down from heaven. You have to believe in those things to be a Muslim, he's essentially saying. This is a really interesting hadith, um, narrated by Abdullah bin Umar, where the Prophet has a vision in his sleep. He sees, he's sleeping, he sees a dream that while he's making tawaf, he sees a man of brown color. Okay, not white, brown color. The best one can see amongst brown colored human beings. So this is he's seeing this in his dream, the Prophet says. His hair was so long that it fell between his shoulders, among the best hair that anyone could have. And his hair was combed. It was as if water was dripping from his head. Keep that imagery in mind because it's going to come back, right? And he was on the shoulders of two other men making tawaf around the Kaaba. And in his dream, he says, "Who is this?" And a voice replied, "This is Jesus, the son of Mary." That imagery is really important, this dream that the Prophet had, because Jesus is making tawaf around the Kaaba. Where did Jesus start? Which temple? The temple that Solomon built that was destroyed 70 years after the leaving of Jesus as a sign that that covenant was lost. Which temple is he making tawaf around now in this dream? The temple that Ishmael built. The temple that Ishmael built as a sign that when Jesus comes back, he's on the covenant, right, of of Muhammad, who is a descendant from Ishmael, and this is the new temple. The Kaaba is the new temple. So that imagery is very profound. The Prophet then sees another man with curly hair. His right eye was blind like an exploded piece of grape, and he says, "Who is this?" And they say, "This is the Antichrist, the pseudo Messiah." Right? And so the two now are contrasted. So this is Sahih in Sahih Muslim, the Muwatta of Imam Malik, the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And the imagery here is very profound. And now it's going to take us into this return of Jesus and his role in killing the Antichrist. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "So I tell you about the Dajjal story of which no prophet," there's a typo here. It should say, "which no prophet failed to mention to their nation." The Dajjal is one-eyed, and he will bring with him that which resembles hell and paradise. His paradise will be hell. His hell will be paradise. I will warn you as Noah warned his nation, meaning all the prophets warned their nation. There's a typo there at the beginning. Just ignore that. He will have kafara imprinted on his forehead. He will have curly legs. And he will have he will have curly hair, and he will have bowed legs. The prophet describes his appearance as being like this. Now, in terms of what he does, there are two main ahadith that are found in the Sunan of Ibn Majah and the Sahih of Muslim, which are deemed to be most likely the most authentic hadith that talk about the coming of the Dajjal and the return of Jesus. So I'm going to take bits and pieces from those two ahadith, and we'll be done here in about 7 minutes. So what is he going to do? Dajjal, he's going to travel extensively between Damascus and Iraq. He goes right, left. The Prophet says, "O servants of God, be steadfast." How long will he stay on the earth? The companions say, the Prophet says 40 days. Now, this is what's interesting. One day is like a year, one day is like a month, one day is like a week, and the rest of the days are like your days. So something is going on with the perception of time. Is it the rotation of the earth? Is it the change of the magnetic poles of the earth or something? Allahu alam, but something's going on with the perception of time. This is a sign of the end of time. Okay. We said, "Oh, Messenger of Allah, how fast will he spread?" He said, "Like rain backed by wind." Another part of the hadith, um, Everywhere will be visited except Mecca and Medina by this Dajjal. And whoever enters into these two cities will be safe because an angel with swords will prevent the Dajjal from entering. He's going to go into a place called Red Zurayd, and the city of Medina will quake three times, and all the hypocrites are going to come out of Medina at that time. So the city of Medina is going to be purified. In another hadith in Sahih Muslim, it said that he's going to emerge from Khurasan, which was old Persia, okay, with 70,000 Jews. And he's going to have all kinds of capabilities. He's going to command the sky to rain, and it's going to rain. He's going to tell the earth to grow grass, it's going to grow grass. Think about for a moment, a lot of people are saying the next world war is going to be over water, or major wars are going to be over water. Major agricultural disasters are going to happen in the future. Um, don't even get me started on the agribusiness industry like Monsanto and the damage that they're causing. But there's likely going to be corporate manipulation of a lot of agribusiness, likely going to be a lot of climate change. For someone to come in and have the ability to manipulate weather, agriculture, he's going to have all the power in the world, right? He's going to have all the wealth in the world. Some nation or group of people might reject them, and he will make them poor right away. It's like he'll have full control of the stock market. Maybe he's got all the Bitcoin. I don't know. It's like he will have the ability to make you poor and destitute right away if you don't believe in him. So he's going to be a major, major fitna. He'll pass by a city. He'll know that there are gold and silver and treasures there. He'll just command the city and it'll come out like bees. Okay. He will take a man full of youth, strike him in half, and kill him, and then suddenly bring him back to life. And so he's going to do things that Jesus did. Remember, he's the false Messiah, right? And yeah, yeah, someone is mentioning AI and the ability of AI to be, you know, have the kind of control that we never even imagined nowadays. Who knows? The Dajjal might have all of his he might have a lot of sort of powers built up in the AI industry. Allahu Alam. But yeah, he's going to tell people that he's their Lord. I'm not going to read these word for word because I want to sort of save time a little bit. But the Prophet says if you read the first few verses from Surah Kaf, it will be a protection from you. Um, One of his trials is to tell a Bedouin, if I resurrect your parents, will you believe in me? And they said, and want the Bedouin to say yes. And two shayateen will come in the form of his mother and father, and the Bedouin will believe. So he has the ability to do magic. He has the ability to do extensive deception, to manipulate resources, command the sky and it rains. Um, Now, just a slight tangent here, all of this, right? And in the midst of all of these descriptions, the prophet still says, I'll tell you something I'm more worried about, though, for you. That's showing off religiously. He says, should I tell you something that's more fearful for me than the fitna of the Dajjal? They said, yes, hidden shirk. Okay. When a person shows off religiously. Okay. So that's important just to keep in context. So, because a lot of Muslims, all they talk about is Dajjal, 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 right? And you tend to forget that jihad against the nafs is the thing you're supposed to be focused on all the time, right? So don't let that slip. Um, uh, okay, now in the midst of all of this, there's no propaganda, weaponry, army, navy, or anything that can defeat the Dajjal, right? Um, the only thing that can defeat him is truth. Abu Huraira says no one will be able to kill the Dajjal except Isa ibn Maryam because he's going to be قول الحق الذي فيه يمترون. Allah mentions him as the word of truth. So Isa alayhi salam, represents the only thing that can destroy this demon-like creature, which is representation of haqq. So no bullet or bomb will kill him. Only truth can destroy him. Okay. Now, the descent of Jesus. At that moment, so this is again the italicized text is taken from the hadith, okay? The non-italicized is just commentary. At that moment, God sends Jesus, the son of Maryam, from heaven. He descends on top of a white minaret at the east of Damascus. Now, just pause here. Other hadith reference Jerusalem as his place of descent. And he's coming down with two angels. Um, and he bows his head, and it's as if water is dropping from his hair. It's as if his hair shines like pearls. And any non-believer who receives his death will die, and his breath reaches as far as his sight. Um, Another something I did not mention here, when he lands, it's Fajr time. And the Mahdi is present. And the Mahdi is leading the prayer. And Jesus will go and pray behind the Mahdi, praying Salah, just like you saw in the New Testament, him praying Salah. First thing he does when he gets back is Salah, just like a moment. First thing you're thinking about, what time is it? Is it prayer time? Right? So Jesus comes back fully Muslim with the Muslims, right? And oh, I did mention it. So that's there in the text there. Then he pursues the Dajjal at the gate of Lod. Okay, so this is in Jerusalem. There's the context here is there's a war between the Muslims and the followers of the Dajjal, and there no one can kill the Dajjal. And at this point, he finds him at the gate of Lod. And when Jesus sees the Dajjal and Dajjal sees Jesus, the Dajjal will melt as salt melts in water. And that is going to mark the end of that war. Now he's going to do three things. He's going to be a just ruler at that time. He's going to establish God's kingdom on earth. It says he's going to break the cross, which is symbolic of him destroying Pauline theology. Okay. He's going to kill the pig, which is, it's not that he's just going to go and kill a pig. What Paul taught is you no longer need to follow the law. He's going to do that to bring back the imagery of following the law. Okay, because one of the things that the Jews were not supposed to do is eat pork. And he's going to abolish the jizya tax. Money is going to be so abundant. Now, abolishing the jizya tax, the jizya is the tax that non-Muslims pay under Muslim rule. There's two opinions here. One opinion is that wealth is going to be so prominent because he's going to establish justice on earth, as the Messiah is supposed to do, that there won't be a need for that. Ibn Ajiba, in his commentary of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, a poem by Imam al-Busiri, he says the reason that he's not the jizya won't be taken anymore is because Jesus is going to essentially tell that you are no longer the people of the book. I do not accept you as people of the book, so I will not accept your jizya, right? So that's pretty powerful. But as you can see, uh, he now, by doing this and destroying the ant, he has now fulfilled the role of the Messiah. He has now fulfilled the role of the Messiah. That role, which the Jews rejected because he didn't do it for them, and the Christians had to take and turn into a metaphor because of the teachings of Paul, the Muslims, what we believe is he will do as the New Testament says he will do, but for the new people of the covenant, the Muslims at the end of time, and he will do everything that the Messiah is supposed to do here, including killing the Antichrist. So look at this verse here. There's some commentary about this verse. وَإِن مِّنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ إِلَّا لَيُؤْمِنَنَّ بِهِ قَبْلَ مَوْتِهِ. There's no one from the people of the book except that they will believe in him before his death. This him and his, it allows for two different opinions. One, you could say that every person who's the person of the people of the book, Jew or Christian, like the moment right before they die, okay, that Jew or Christian will see something that will show them who Jesus actually was. And they will believe, but then they'll die and it won't be counted. That's the minority opinion. That's the minority. The major opinion, the dominant opinion, is that they will believe in Jesus before the death of Jesus, meaning Jesus hasn't died yet. He will only die his natural death when he comes back as a Messiah. And at that point, once he's established that he is on the deen of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Then all people of it, they will believe in him as he truly is before Jesus' death. So the verse allows the possibility of both interpretations. So we'll just end on this. As you can see, the Islamic version of Jesus is the only version that fulfills him as the Messiah according to the very verses that were supposed to set the definition of what the Messiah is. It doesn't work in Judaism and it doesn't work in Christianity. That is the compassion of Jesus. That is the return of Jesus. And that is the role. So someone has a question, is the Mahdi still considered a Messiah? No, the Mahdi is not considered a Messiah. The Mahdi is a righteous Muslim who's going to be a leader for all the Muslims, and Jesus will pray behind him, but the Mahdi does not have any special abilities or powers or titles beyond that. So that's the conclusion. We can take any questions. I'm sorry, this went over about 20 minutes. I do apologize. This ate into the tea time. Um, but as I was preparing this, I don't know how I could talk about this without talking about that. It just went on and on. So I do apologize for going over here. Um, but yeah, we can take the questions tomorrow, or we can take questions now. Or if anyone wants to add something, please add something or commentary. I would love to hear your commentary.
Bismillah. No, you can take all the time you need, Sheikh Kiaresh, for the presentation. We do have some time built into the program for questions, but let us transition now to the same break that we had scheduled. But we will meet at the top of the hour, inshallah. I realize it's what, 12:30 Eastern now, so let us meet at 1. Is that okay? So you can still have.
11.
Oh, it's
It's
11.
a 11:30 Eastern time.
I'm sorry.
11:30 Eastern time.
My this happened yesterday as well. So let us meet at the top of the hour, 12. We'll get started right away at 12. But you'll have your time, inshallah, for your break. And I just want to thank Dr. Kiaresh for a brilliant, absolutely brilliant survey covering centuries in an hour and a half. And the slides were extremely helpful. The bringing this all together, especially with this chart here, was just like very, very insightful. I didn't, yeah, I never saw it like that, I never considered it like this. I did want to mention that I misspoke when I ascribed the book of Acts to Mark. It was actually Luke who wrote the book of Acts and not Mark. But
Okay.
so I wanted to make that clarification. But this was just incredible. It was just incredible. And so I'm looking forward to the questions that are going to come out of this in the Q&A session. And I would hope that you would be able to join that session, Dr. Kiresh, but we can
I
talk
I
about that
I
offline.
don't know if I'll
Yeah.
be, but I'll be back tomorrow for sure at
No.
at that scheduled time. So if there's anything that you
What
want
we
to
may
punt
be able to
towards,
do, if you're able to join earlier tomorrow for a half an hour earlier, then maybe we
I'll
can have
see.
the
Yeah,
Q&A with you
uh,
earlier.
I'll try. I'll try. Let me talk to my
Inshallah,
wife.
inshallah,
See.
because I mean, it's just like an amazing, amazing presentation here, and I'm sure that we have a lot of questions that came about. So let us transition now. Jazakumullah khairan. Allah bless you and thank you for enlightening us. This is why we do this every year. This is why we do this every year. And it takes an annual event to just keep going over this information and keep layering it because it is a very complicated history. It is a very contested history, and you know the what you've brought to it this year is just absolutely phenomenal. Alhamdulillah. And so let's meet at the top of the hour. Jazakumullahu khairan. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر